Some humiliations don't happen in private. They happen under fluorescent office lights, in rooms with glass walls and polite furniture, while people in expensive suits pretend not to hear the thing they'll be talking about all week. That was the kind of humiliation Elena Vale walked into on a Thursday afternoon when her boss called her into his office, closed the door, slid a termination letter across the desk, and told her she had never belonged in his company in the first place. He didn't say she was underqualified. He didn't say she had failed. He didn't even accuse her of doing bad work. What he said was far more personal and far more calculated. He looked at her, in front of his assistant, in front of HR, in front of people who had watched her hold his company together for nearly 2 years, and he called her a gold digger. Then he told her women like her only got this far by attaching themselves to powerful men. And if that had been the whole story, it would have been cruel enough. But it wasn't the whole story. Because what Adrian Mercer didn't know, standing there in his custom suit and his corner office and his certainty that he had just destroyed someone beneath him, was that Elena had spent months preparing for that exact moment. By the time she stepped out of his office holding that termination letter, the paperwork to take his company away from him was already moving. And before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If you only saw Mercer Capital from the outside, you would have thought Adrian Mercer had built the perfect life. His company sat in one of those gleaming downtown towers designed to look like money even before you stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and luxury perfume. His interviews appeared in business magazines with headlines about vision, discipline, and leadership. Investors liked him because he knew how to perform confidence. Employees feared him because he knew how to use uncertainty as a weapon. He had mastered the kind of corporate power that doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it only needs a smile, a pause in the middle of a meeting, or a casual remark placed exactly where it can do the most damage. And by the time Elena joined Mercer Capital as head of strategy, Adrian had spent years building a reputation that made him look untouchable. To the board, he was the face of the firm. To clients, he was the closer. To the press, he was a self-made operator with perfect instincts. But inside the company, the truth was messier. The deals were not as clean as they looked. The growth wasn't as stable as the press releases suggested. The man who loved talking about discipline had a habit of making reckless promises and leaving other people to absorb the consequences. And the woman he would eventually call a gold digger had become one of the people most responsible for cleaning up the damage. Elena didn't arrive at Mercer Capital the way Adrian assumed she had. That assumption, in many ways, was the beginning of his downfall. She was not a desperate employee trying to marry her way into a better life. She wasn't some assistant who had wandered into the wrong floor of the building and accidentally ended up in strategy meetings. She came in with a resume strong enough to unsettle any insecure executive. Before Mercer, she had co-founded a consulting firm, sold her stake young, and built a reputation for fixing broken operations in industries where ego usually gets people in trouble faster than incompetence does. She had the kind of mind that saw patterns before other people admitted there was a pattern. She could sit through a presentation full of polished numbers and feel, almost physically, when something underneath them didn't line up. She understood how money moved, how power protected itself, and how weak leadership often disguised itself as confidence. But she also understood something else. Access matters. If you want to know where a company is strong, you can study its reports. If you want to know where it's vulnerable, you have to get inside. That was part of what brought her to Mercer Capital. Adrian thought he had hired a strategist who would make him look sharper in board meetings. What he actually hired was a woman who knew how to read the seams of an empire while the man at the top was still admiring the paint. At first, Adrian seemed pleased with her. Elena was efficient, calm, and far more useful than he expected. She stepped into a company full of half-finished systems, overpromised deals, and senior managers too afraid to contradict the boss who signed their bonuses. Within months, she had restructured departments that were quietly bleeding money, renegotiated an acquisition that had been drifting toward disaster, and repaired a relationship with one of Mercer Capital's most important investors after Adrian nearly destroyed it at a dinner where he drank too much and talked too loudly. She built strategy decks he later presented as if they had materialized from his own mind. She stayed late rewriting investor memos after his edits made them weaker. She learned which executives were competent, which ones were loyal only to whoever looked strongest in the room, and which ones had quietly given up trying to fix anything. And because Elena did all of this without performing gratitude, without flirting for favor, without asking Adrian for approval, he made a mistake that powerful men make all the time. He decided her composure meant she was harmless. He mistook her refusal to beg for his attention as evidence that she didn't understand the game. In reality, she understood it better than most of the people sitting around that boardroom table. The first signs of trouble were subtle, almost easy to dismiss if you didn't know what you were looking at. A debt schedule attached to one of Mercer's hospitality subsidiaries didn't match the figures in a board packet. A delayed payment obligation vanished from an investor memo. A valuation was just optimistic enough to raise an eyebrow, but not dramatic enough to cause immediate alarm. In companies like Mercer Capital, the people at the top often depend on everyone beneath them being too overworked, too intimidated, or too disconnected to put the full picture together. Elena did the opposite. She started saving documents. She built timelines. She compared board materials to internal files, traced revisions, and noted which numbers changed depending on who the audience was. What she found wasn't one catastrophic fraud that would make headlines overnight. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more dangerous. A pattern of manipulation, concealment, and reckless decision-making held together by Adrian's confidence that no one would challenge him before he had time to spin the story. The company wasn't dead, but it was weaker than it looked. Bad acquisitions had been dressed up as strategic bets. Liabilities were being pushed just far enough into the future to keep current conversations comfortable. Investor trust was being managed, not earned. And Adrian, protected by years of deference, acted like a man who believed he could keep moving numbers around until reality got tired of chasing him. If Adrian had simply been arrogant, the story might have ended with Elena resigning and taking a better offer somewhere else. But arrogance wasn't the only thing driving him. The more the board started trusting Elena, the more personal his behavior became. At first it came in the form of small insults disguised as jokes. He would compliment her in public and undermine her in private. He would thank her for saving a project, then tell people she was good support, instead of the person who had actually done the heavy lifting. He began talking over her in meetings, then asking her afterward to prepare follow-up work he could take credit for later. One investor started emailing Elena directly to clarify points Adrian had misrepresented, and that changed something in him. A client thanked her at dinner for being the adult in the room, and his smile tightened. A board member asked for her opinion after Adrian had already spoken, and from that point on his attitude toward her became colder, sharper, more deliberate. The man who once treated her like a useful asset began treating her like a threat that needed to be reduced before anyone else noticed how much influence she was quietly accumulating. Then came the comments. The rumors. The kind of poison that powerful people use when they don't have a clean way to attack your work, so they go after your character instead. One night after a client dinner, Elena returned from the restroom and heard Adrian laughing with two senior executives outside the private room. He said women like her were always strategic. He said nobody wore a watch that expensive on a salary like hers unless there was a man behind it. One of the men joked about whether she was sleeping with someone on the board. Adrian didn't shut it down. He fed it. He shrugged and said women like Elena didn't end up in rooms like that by accident. In a single moment, he reduced intelligence, discipline, and results to a story that made him feel safer. And that's what these comments often are. They are not observations. They are panic in a more socially acceptable outfit. They are what insecure people reach for when someone else's competence exposes the limits of their own. Elena stood there long enough to hear the laughter, long enough to understand that this wasn't going to stay at the level of office tension, and long enough to realize something that would shape everything that followed. Adrian Mercer wasn't just threatened by her. He was willing to damage her reputation to protect his own position. That was when Elena stopped thinking like an employee and started thinking like an owner. She had grown up around people who understood leverage. Her mother ran a respected legal practice. Her father spent decades buying distressed assets and turning them into profitable businesses. She had watched people at dinner talk about acquisitions, litigation risk, debt structures, and the difference between what a company says it's worth and what it can actually survive. So when she looked at Mercer Capital, she didn't just see a toxic boss and a difficult workplace. She saw an overvalued company with weak internal controls, a board that was beginning to lose confidence in its CEO, and a leader arrogant enough to think his title protected him from consequences. She also saw an opportunity. If the company was being mismanaged, if investors were already uneasy, if the board needed a path to remove Adrian without detonating the value of the firm, then the question wasn't whether Mercer Capital was vulnerable. The question was who would move first. Elena started speaking quietly to the people Adrian underestimated most. Lawyers, one or two investors who had begun to suspect the same problems she had, and a board member who understood that if they waited too long, Mercer's damage would become more expensive to contain. None of it happened in one dramatic montage. It happened the way real corporate power shifts often happen. In careful calls, in discreet meetings, in revised documents, in numbers reviewed twice, in language negotiated line by line until a possibility becomes a strategy and a strategy becomes a timetable. For 4 months, Adrian continued behaving like a man who believed he was untouchable. He humiliated junior staff in meetings. He signed off on decisions he barely understood. He spent money to preserve the image of control while Elena, almost invisibly, assembled the mechanism that would eventually remove him from the company he thought was his kingdom. She documented irregularities not to play detective, but to protect the transaction from challenge when the time came. She learned which board members would fold under pressure and which ones were already tired of cleaning up Adrian's messes. She secured financing. She prepared legal cover. She built the kind of case that doesn't need to shout because it's already sitting in the numbers. And still, despite all of that, there was one thing she hadn't fully accounted for: how far Adrian would go when he felt the ground shift under him. People like him often sense danger before they understand it. They notice the temperature in a room changing. They notice when people start directing questions elsewhere. They notice when admiration becomes politeness. Adrian may not have known Elena was preparing to buy the company, but he knew he was losing his hold on the narrative. And rather than tightening his work, he tightened his cruelty. He needed to make her smaller before anyone else realized how much larger she had become. That brings us back to the afternoon he fired her. He called Elena into his office with the kind of false calm that usually means someone has rehearsed the performance. HR was there. His assistant was there. 2 senior staff members lingered near the glass wall outside, close enough to hear if they wanted to, and of course they wanted to. Adrian handed over the termination letter and spoke to her like a man trying to leave a bruise that wouldn't show up on camera. He accused her of disloyalty, of professional misconduct, of misalignment with company values, which might have been funny if it weren't so shameless. When she refused to react, he escalated. He called her a gold digger. He told her women like her only made it that far by attaching themselves to powerful men. He smiled because humiliation was the point. He wanted witnesses. He wanted Elena carrying that moment around like a stain. But humiliation has a strange relationship with timing. In the wrong hands, it crushes people. In the right hands, it clarifies everything. Elena looked at the termination letter, folded it once, slipped it into her bag, and walked out without giving him the satisfaction of a scene. Behind her, Adrian joked that security should deactivate her access before she got any bright ideas. He had no idea how late he was. The bright idea had already become contracts, approvals, signatures waiting for final execution. By the time the elevator doors closed, Elena wasn't thinking about the insult anymore. She was thinking about the phone call she was about to make. Outside the building, she called her lawyer. There are moments in life when everything slows down, not because you are calm, but because your mind understands that the next few minutes will redraw the map of your life. This was one of those moments. Her lawyer answered on the second ring. Elena said she had been fired. There was a pause, then the question that mattered. Did he say anything stupid? Elena said yes. He called me a gold digger. Her lawyer's response was simple. Good. Let's finish this. What happened over the next 40 minutes wasn't glamorous. This is the part revenge fantasies usually skip because paperwork doesn't make people gasp the way confrontations do. But this is where real power lies. Board counsel sent the final transfer language. Investor approvals were confirmed. The financing mechanism they had spent months preparing was activated. A board member who had been waiting for the cleanest possible window to move against Adrian understood that he had just been handed one. His public humiliation of Elena didn't create the deal, but it removed the last hesitation. If there was ever a moment to formalize the leadership change before Adrian had time to regroup, It was now. Elena reviewed the documents from the back seat of a waiting car, took the necessary calls, and signed the final acquisition papers at 3:07 p.m. Mercer Capital was no longer Adrian Mercer's company. It was hers. There's a temptation in stories like this to describe that moment as triumphant, but Elena would later think of it differently. It didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a lock clicking into place. Something colder than joy, but steadier. The kind of certainty that comes after a door closes behind you, and you realize there is no going back to the person you were an hour earlier. Her assistant called to ask the question anyone would ask in that moment. Are you really going back there? Elena said yes. He's in a board meeting, the assistant warned. I know, Elena replied. Do you want me to alert anyone? No. I'd rather see his face before anyone has time to prepare him. That line tells you everything about who she had become by then. This was no longer about a bruised ego. It was about sequence, timing, impact, the controlled unveiling of a truth Adrian had spent years insulating himself from. That his authority was conditional, his company vulnerable, and the woman he thought he had dismissed as decorative had understood the value of his empire more clearly than he ever had. When Elena walked back into Mercer Capital less than an hour after being fired, the building was exactly the same and completely different. The lobby was still polished. The elevator still moved with the same quiet efficiency. The executive floor still carried that expensive hush designed to make power feel inevitable. But Elena wasn't entering as an employee anymore. She was walking toward a boardroom where the future of the company had already changed on paper, and only one man in the room didn't know it yet. The receptionist on the executive floor looked up and froze. Elena asked if the board was still in conference room A, and when the woman nodded, Elena kept walking. She passed Adrian's office without stopping. The same office where he had tried to reduce her to a stereotype. The same office where he had confused insult with authority. At the end of the hall, the glass doors to the boardroom were partly open, and Adrian's voice was already carrying through them. He was talking about a portfolio move, about leverage, about urgency, about the usual things men say when they are still performing control for a room that has already decided to remove them from it. Elena pushed the door open. Every head turned. Adrian stopped speaking. The next few seconds mattered because of how ordinary they looked from the outside. That's the thing about dramatic power shifts in professional settings. They rarely come with thunder. They come with silence. Adrian looked confused at first, then irritated, then amused in the way people get when they assume they're still the most powerful person in the room. He asked why security had allowed her back upstairs. No one laughed. No one moved. That was the first sign he had missed something important. The board chair, Margaret Levinson, said Elena was there at her request. Elena stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. Adrian asked what it was. Margaret answered before Elena needed to. Transfer of controlling ownership, effective immediately. Adrian frowned, waiting for someone to clarify the joke. Then legal counsel slid another set of documents toward him and said the words that would separate the life Adrian had been living from the one he was about to enter. As of 3:07 p.m. that day, Elena Vale had become majority owner of Mercer Capital through a board-approved acquisition agreement. People love imagining what a villain's face looks like in a moment like that, but the truth is usually more human and more revealing. First comes disbelief, then the frantic attempt to recalculate, then the dawning realization that everyone else in the room has been informed of something you are only now learning. And finally, if the person has built their identity around control, fear. Adrian stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. He said it was insane. He said Elena had been an employee that morning. She replied, very quietly, former employee. It's a small line, but in stories like this, small lines are often the ones that do the most damage because they expose a new reality without raising the speaker's voice. Adrian tried to recover by calling the move emotional, reckless, retaliatory. Elena didn't take the bait. She asked if he really wanted to use the word reckless while sitting on top of buried debt, inflated projections, and years of treating company assets like a private rewards program. That was the moment the color drained from his face. Not because he suddenly felt guilty, but because he realized the scope of what she knew. He told her to be careful about what she was implying. She told him she wasn't implying anything. She was choosing to keep the room civil. There is a particular kind of humiliation reserved for people who weaponize shame and then find themselves unable to control the terms of their own exposure. Adrian looked around the table for support. He found none. One investor wouldn't even meet his eyes. The board asked for his resignation effective immediately. He accused Elena of planning everything. She said yes. He laughed bitterly and called it betrayal. She told him she had saved a company he was slowly destroying, while he convinced himself he was untouchable. Then came the line that would become the center of the story. Adrian had called her a gold digger because he wanted to reduce her to someone chasing a man's money. Elena gave him the line back, but she gave it back sharpened. She told him he had been right about one thing. She was there for the money. She just wasn't after his. She was after the company he had been too arrogant to realize he had already lost. It's a line that works because it isn't only about revenge. It's about correction. Adrian had spent months, maybe years, building a narrative about Elena that made him feel safer. In one sentence, she dismantled it and replaced it with the truth. She told him he had mistaken composure for weakness, polish for dependence, silence for surrender. Then she told him to leave his access card on the table. For a moment, it looked as if he might argue, or shout, or do something dramatic enough to make himself feel powerful one last time. Instead, he reached into his pocket with a hand that no longer looked steady, dropped the card onto the polished wood, and walked out. The sound it made was small, almost embarrassingly small. But sometimes the end of a career doesn't arrive with a crash. Sometimes it arrives with a plastic key card landing on a conference table, while a room full of people watches the man who used to own the air around him realize he no longer owns anything at all. If the story ended there, it would still be satisfying. But the part that matters most in stories like this is often what comes after the confrontation, when the cameras would usually cut away and real life begins doing the harder work of consequence. Elena's first move as owner of Mercer Capital wasn't to celebrate. It was to order a full internal audit. She didn't need revenge anymore. She needed the truth documented, the weak points identified, the rot exposed in a way that could be repaired instead of denied. She met with department heads Adrian had spent years intimidating into silence and told them something they hadn't heard from leadership in a very long time. No more loyalty to dysfunction. No more protecting people because they're powerful. No more shrinking yourselves to keep one man comfortable. Problems would be fixed. Lies would be confronted. Anyone making the company smaller so they could feel larger would be removed. Some of the people in those meetings looked stunned. A few looked as if they were trying not to cry. Within weeks, 2 executives resigned before the audit reached them. A senior finance manager admitted he had been pressured to soften reporting language. An assistant who had spent months cleaning up Adrian's private messes sent Elena a detailed email explaining how much energy the company had wasted protecting one man's image. Mercer Capital didn't become perfect overnight, but it became honest enough to heal. Deadweight was cut. Debt was stabilized. Competent people who had been overlooked under Adrian were promoted into roles they had already been performing unofficially. The company stopped operating like a stage built around one man's ego and started functioning like a business again. And what about Adrian? Stories like this always leave people curious about the villain's ending, but endings are rarely as neat as audiences want them to be. Rumors moved quickly. Some said he was trying to start another fund. Some said investors had quietly blacklisted him. Some said he was furious that no one from his old team followed him out the door. Elena didn't spend much time checking. Once he was gone, he stopped being her problem. The insult he had thrown at her that afternoon didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It stopped being a wound and became a reminder of how often people explain away a woman's success by choosing the story that hurts her most. If she's polished, she must be manipulative. If she's ambitious, she must be cold. If she's wealthy, she must have taken a shortcut. If she stays calm, she must be weak. Those stories don't tell you anything useful about the woman being judged. They tell you everything about the insecurity of the person doing the judging. Adrian Mercer thought he was firing an employee. What he was actually doing was handing the company to the one person in the building who understood its value better than he did. And maybe that's the part that lingers after the revenge fades. Not the boardroom scene. Not the access card. Not even the line about the money. It's the lesson underneath all of it. Never waste your life trying to prove your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Build quietly. Pay attention. Let people underestimate you if they need to. And when the moment comes, make sure the truth costs them more than the lie ever cost you.